A lot of people are feeling sick, and this headline has caught the attention because a lot of people are saying this over and over again. I just keep on getting sick, and nobody is able to explain why. I'm here to try and break down the science and to try and give you an insight into how the immune system works, and critically, what has happened over the pandemic that nobody wants to talk about. And this understanding will help you to explain to others as to what in the world is going on. The truth is that I was reminded of this because of a paper that came out quite recently, and it was looking at kidney transplant recipients. And they were looking at what happened with nasal mucosal antibodies to SARS-CoV-2 that can inhibit the ability of the virus to cause infection following mRNA vaccination. This is a kind of research that we needed really early on. But for some reason, I don't know why, this was just not done. And when we look carefully at this paper, it's fascinating the fact that down here, when they look at the controls and so on, and when they admitted it, the study, this was done in 2021. And you think to yourself, you can see here, they were looking at participants who received a dose between the 2nd of November and the November 2nd and November 11th in 2021. So this data was here. As to why it hasn't been looked at or published until now, I have no idea. But it gives some very, very important principles as to what is happening with regards to immunity. So I'm just going to take you through some slides that I've created so that you can understand just how this works. So the first thing you have to understand is that the virus has to infect a cell in order to replicate. And your immune system is very sophisticated. It has multiple layers of protection. And in the upper airway, where this virus comes in, it uses very simple methods, like, for instance, mucus production. This is why, if you get a cold, you're producing a lot of mucus, runny nose, because the virus can't get to the cell if there is a lot of mucus there. So that's a simple mechanical strategy that the body uses. But one of the really important things is to do with secretory IgA. Now, if you haven't heard about this before, this is a really important point. So, when we look at what happens in your mucosal area, when the virus enters and tries to get past the mucus lining over the cells that it needs to infect, stuck inside this is secretory IgA. It's a special kind of antibody that only exists primarily in this mucosal barrier. So when the virus gets hitched by it, suddenly it's unable to bind. And this is why then you cough or sneeze and you will get rid of the virus because it's unable to infect the cells. So, this secretory IgA is one of the most important strategies that you have to protect against respiratory viruses like SARS-CoV-2. So, when you have strong mucosal immunity, you usually mean you are producing adequate and appropriate kinds of secretory IgA to help to get rid of the virus. Now, one of the points that I'd always said from 2021 was that in this virus, different to some other viruses, because it is so good at evading the immune system, if you give a systemic vaccine, so an injectable vaccine, it is unlikely to train the mucosal immunity. So it will train the soldiers in your lymph nodes, the soldiers in the spleen, the soldiers in the bloodstream, but the border patrols are not adequately trained. And so what then happens is that where you need to control the infection, it's difficult to do. And just to give you a context, I've created a slide here to help you to understand what I mean with regards to that border patrol work that your mucosal immunity needs to do. Just imagine that your border patrol is looking for someone, but they have been told to look for someone with a red jacket. This person, if they come along with a red jacket, they will pick them up and be able to stop them. But what happens if this person changes their jacket or changes their headgear or puts on glasses? Suddenly, if the Border Patrol has not been trained to look at their height, their build, their walk pattern, their gait, and many other things, they still can't evade the system to get through the border. So, in effect, your mucosal immunity is this border. And the problem seems to be the Border Patrol in people who were vaccinated is too focused on the spike protein. And so they're primarily looking for the red jacket. This is a very simple but really important context. And it helps us to understand why this is such a critical part of what was done. So, this paper was looking at what happened with patients who were kidney transplant recipients, were therefore on immune suppression. And when they looked specifically at the conclusion, they did find that they developed nasal mucosal antibodies, which were able to inhibit after vaccination, but at lower concentrations than the controls. So you have to understand what that means. And again, I've taken the time to put together a slide to try and see if you can grasp this because these are important nuances. When you inject the vaccine in the arm, it triggers an immune response systemically, but it produces only a weak immune response at the mucosal barrier where the virus enters. And so you have put soldiers in and around all the streets in the city with snipers, but where the virus is entering through the border, they're not particularly well trained. So you're setting up a system that is only going to respond after the virus has gotten in. And this is what the study was showing. So, even though COVID vaccines can create some nasal protection, it is less than healthy immune systems. And when I say that, I'm talking about natural immunity. And so what they found is antibodies were found in the nose, but at lower levels. Now, you need these to block the virus from getting into the systemic circulation. But the levels were much lower in those who were mRNA vaccinated than the control group. And so some of these patients had very little nasal protection, even though they had multiple doses. And so, in a healthy response here, you get this. Now, the kidney transplant patients do have a weaker mucosal response and generally an immune response that's weaker. But the point is that this is in play across the board. It's difficult to train the mucosal lining from a systemic injectable vaccine. And this was one of the reasons why I had always said that the target when we were doing the warp speed shouldn't just have been about getting a systemic vaccine. They should have done as much attention on a mucosal vaccine because this is exactly where the virus breaks through the system. The problem we have now is that because this was deployed across the population. Now, this is what I've been saying since 2021. Now, some people may disagree with this, but the point is simple. When you deploy this and it has an impact on the circulation or on the immune response in the systemic circulation, but not necessarily mucosally, you are then unlikely to be able to stop infection and transmission. So, if you were targeting trying to stop the virus from circulating, your target would have to be the mucosal lining to strengthen it, not necessarily systemic. Now, it was possible at the time in 2021 that they could have used a double approach. You use systemic for people who were high risk and mucosal for those who were at low risk, and you wanted to stop them transmitting the virus. That would have made perfect sense, but it may not have been as financially viable, because then you wouldn't necessarily need as many doses. That's me being a little bit cynical here, but you get the point. We needed multiple strategies. And so I'm very clear that I have never said that you didn't need injectable vaccines, but these were for people who were at high risk, who had not been exposed to the virus. That's who needed the systemic vaccines. If you wanted to stop transmission, you needed mucosal vaccines. Now, because we didn't apply that, and I guess hindsight is 2020, we now have a problem. And this is why people keep getting sick. Now, follow along here. One of the really interesting things about the immune response, and we've learned this from the research, that the immune response seems in the mucosa to not just be secretory IgA, but specifically T cells. These are like your, I guess you could call them your Marines or your Navy SEALs that just go and rather than shooting the virus, they blow up the building and they kill the infected cells. So these T cells in are your mucosal defenders. And what they do is that, let's just say your secretory IgA was able to work, but not well enough. The virus still gets into a cell. It starts to replicate. What then happens is that the T cell immune response, if it had been trained, comes, identifies the cell, targets it, blows it up. Suddenly, thousands, if not millions, of viral particles are destroyed, and so therefore it makes it much more difficult for the virus to break through this kind of sophisticated immune system. Now, the point is that because people will say, well, the truth is it didn't matter if you were vaccinated or naturally infected, because in both cases you will have T cell immunity. I say, yes, you will, but there will be a difference because of what we call almost immune targeting, to an extent where the immune system is struggling to change its angle. So now this again is really important. When we looked at the immune response after natural infection, spike targeting was only about 21% of the epitopes. Most of the targeting was for proteins that the virus made inside the cell. Now, the way how cells work is that it's almost like blockchain inside the cell, in that every protein that is made inside the cell, they also put a tag on the outside of the cell to say, we have made this. So this is how the T cells are able to target cells that are infected, because they still have to put a tag for the spike protein on the surface. They have to put a tag for the nucleocapsid protein, for the ORF proteins, for the NSF proteins, for the membrane proteins, for the envelope proteins. All of that, the T cells will be trained on with regards to natural immunity. Here is what I think is the difference between the two. In this case, where we have a population that broadly has a spike focused immune response, you do have T cells, but they are only seeing the infected cells that have spike protein on them. However, with a broad immune response, what you would then have is multiple T cells targeting different proteins: spike protein, nucleocapsid protein, ORF proteins, membrane proteins, envelope proteins, NSP proteins. And therefore, they have a broader targeting that makes it much more difficult for the virus to get through. Now, it's important to note that this is not the whole picture. This is just one aspect of the picture. I haven't even talked about things like interferon autoantibodies and vitamin deficiencies and so on. But just purely from an immune perspective, what we seem to be having is a population that doesn't have a well trained border patrol. Therefore, what is happening is that they're getting sick all the time because virus is getting through the border and they have to fight it off each time. And you realize that once this virus gets through the border, it does damage inside the city. And so you don't want that to happen. And so people are getting weaker and weaker. The immune response is getting poorer and poorer. They're getting more and more infections. Nobody knows why. They just find that nothing is changing. This is why I'm explaining what is going on here. The principle, again, let me reiterate the point with regards to the Border Patrol, is that when you have a population, and remember, this doesn't happen to every single person who is vaccinated, and not necessarily everyone who has natural immunity has broad immunity. Nothing is as ever as specific as that. This is about general principles. You are likely to have a more spike specific response in a proportion of the population that has been vaccinated, and you are more likely to have a broad immune response in the population who had natural immunity. And this is what it looks like. As I said before, spike immunity, the Border Patrol is only looking for this. He will not see anything else. Conversely, a well trained Border Patrol, no matter if he changes the hat, changes the glasses, puts on a different coat, this will still pick it up. And what this means is that the border becomes leaky. This is almost a political situation now because this is what many countries are complaining about is that their borders are leaky. So you should understand the principle with regards to that immune system. When the borders are leaky, it means that you have to do the fight on the inside with systemic immune tools, which can cause damage elsewhere. Here is the principle that I want you to leave with. We are now at a situation where there doesn't seem to be any way that in highly vaccinated regions they will be able to control circulation of COVID. Even though people are having less symptoms, it doesn't mean that the infection is not still doing damage. And this is why my pandemic trajectory is showing changes across the board, multiple organs, neurological, liver, heart, kidney. People are getting sicker. And you will know this as well from family and friends. We need first clarity, honesty, and a very clear way that we can find solutions for this. In another presentation, I will share what I think are simple strategies that any and everybody can use to try and see if they could make a difference to improve their mucosal immunity and reduce the risk of infection, because that's all we can hope for at this point. Everybody's being exposed. Everybody's at risk. You need to take care of your health. That's the general principle at the moment. And I will continue to share these ideas with you over time because it seems nobody is interested in explaining what had happened and what is happening. Have a great evening.